And hey, if you can't see that one, you could look at that one. Look behind you. It's not quite as clear. All right, let's see. Right here, yeah. Thanks for the tip. Yeah. We used to only have that one. And then he got those two because if it was harder, I don't know. So yeah, it's kind of weird, but it's been that way for so long now that. And it kind of depends on what you're looking at. Some things, it's better to look at these screens. Some things, it's better to look at that screen. That's what I'm doing. I'm looking at Facebook and seeing what's going on. Okay, there I am. Okay. Yeah, looks like I'm in the middle of that. Okay. There they are. Now I see you guys. All right, before we get started, let's pray. Father, we are so grateful for your Son and for the life that he lived and for the example that he left us. And so as we look at pictures and talk about his life and the places that he lived and went, we just ask that you would help us to, during the whole thing, ask ourselves, in what way is he asking us to change our lives and our behavior so that we can become more like him. It's in his name that we pray. Amen. All right, so Facebook people, if you can't hear me, just let me know and I'll take care of that. And if anybody on Facebook has questions, you can type them in and maybe I could get to them. All right, so I decided I would do this again because it was about the year anniversary of when I went, and it started showing up on my memories on Facebook, and I was like, yeah, I think I'll do that. So the church sent me and my son Jonathan, because Judy doesn't travel. My wife doesn't. It wouldn't have been fun for her, let me put it that way. And so since I had my heart attack only like August 14th, so like 5 months before, they were like, well, we don't really want to send you alone. So they sent a chaperone with me, which was my son. And so he and I had a great time. At least I had a great time. And he, for the most part, I think had a good time. But this is Ben Gurion Airport. And so that was our first introduction to Israel. And I don't know if you can tell by looking, but let's see, there it is. That right there is the center of the airport, and this all around is kind of, once you get inside, it's like the area where people kind of congregate and mill, and it has the duty-free shop and all that stuff like that. But this thing is like a fortress, and you can tell, it's hard to tell, but there is nothing for miles around this thing where, it's just like you're flying along and it's this big city, and then all of a sudden it's a massive area where there's not a whole lot going on. And then over in this area and beyond, there were, you can't see the tanks that are up there, but they're there. And so, yeah, it was strange because I never knew that much about the politics of Israel. And so while we were there, it was like that was one of the interesting things that I learned more about. There it is again. Once we landed, I could take a picture out the window. And we landed on Shabbat, Saturday, which, El Al, the Israeli airline, doesn't fly on Shabbat. And so we had to fly in on British Airways. And it's like the whole country kind of shuts down, like everything shuts down. And so I was told that this is us kind of walking down one of those long spokes that you saw in the picture before. This is us walking down one of those. And what they told us was if it wasn't Shabbat, that thing would have been just packed full of people. So it was kind of cool to fly in And that, I don't know if that looks crowded to you or not, but they said no. That is not crowded at all. And they had a McDonald's and kosher. The Israelis, well, the Jews, don't mix beef, any kind of meat, and dairy. And so you can't get a cheeseburger in Israel. At least I never found a place in all of Israel. You'd go up there to get something. You could get a hamburger, no cheese, and you could get a grilled cheese. I thought later I should have bought one of each, but you might get in trouble. I don't know. I don't think so. But so yeah, it's very strange. It all goes to, in Leviticus, there's a place where God says to Israel, don't boil the kid, talking about goats, don't boil the kid in his mother's milk. And nobody knows for sure why God said that. A lot of the dietary laws that God gave to Israel made a lot of sense thousands of years later when scientists started to realize, okay, these things are, like there's a reason why you out in the desert wandering around, you shouldn't be eating shellfish and all these other things that it turns out were really smart dietary guidelines. Nobody knows for sure why the whole don't boil the kid in the mother's milk. I suspect it has more to do with cruelty than it does actual dietary guidelines. But the Talmud and the Mishnah, have you guys ever heard of the Talmud and the Mishnah? They are like the commentary on the Jewish law. And for about 500 years, rabbis met together in Tiberias, Israel, which is on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, and then there was another group that was meeting in Babylon, because Babylon was still a place where a lot of the Jews didn't leave when they were allowed to go back, and so it becomes one of the most powerful voices of Judaism in the ancient world. And so you have these two groups working, and what they do is they pick one law, and they'll spend weeks arguing, what does this mean? And so like we've talked about before, how it says you shall rest on the Sabbath, and so then they wanted to talk about what is rest, what is work, and so like they decided that when it comes to walking, you could only walk 2,000 paces from your home, and that's nowhere in the Bible, but that's this group of rabbis who were very revered, and that's why it still stands to this day. They came up with that rule. But when they got to you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk, that's what they decided. God doesn't want dairy and meat served at the same meal. That's what they decided. And not only that, you can't even have the two in the same kitchen, really. And now the Jews, they have a thing where they'll have a refrigerator for meat and a refrigerator for dairy on opposite sides of the kitchen. They've made a stipulation, you can have them in the same kitchen, but like you can't, if you're preparing meat, you have to have a table for preparing meat, like a counter for that. You have to have another counter completely separate that's for when you're doing dairy stuff. And so yeah, that's just one of those things. It's just a reminder as you're going through there, you're like, oh yeah, that's right. Judaism has got a lot of really interesting rules that you look at it in the Bible, you're like, why? It's because of those Jews out there, the Jews at Tiberias doing the Talmud and the Mishnah. So I don't know what that was. I just thought it was cool. It's probably the air traffic control tower, but I don't know. So this is where we flew in, and this is where we were going, Jerusalem. And so 43 minutes is what it took. But anytime you're driving through Israel, it's very strange because it's like you've got Israel, you've got the West Bank that is kind of controlled by the Palestinians, and then you've got parts of the West Bank that are completely controlled by the Palestinians. And so they had these three different zones, A, B, and C. And hey, how you doing, buddy? You have something for me? You can give it to me later. A is completely Palestinian controlled, and they'll have this great big sign. I got one, I think, that I'll show you in a few minutes. And it basically says, if you're Israeli, do not proceed beyond this point. Because you're not allowed, and it's incredibly dangerous. And it says on there, if you are a tourist, proceed with extreme caution, and you better have somebody with you that knows what they're doing, type of thing. So there were certain places in Israel that you just, like, we couldn't go to Jericho because it is one of those. We couldn't go to Nablus, we couldn't go to Hebron, places like that that are really important in the Bible, but are controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Then you had B, which was sort of co-hosted, co-controlled by the two different groups, and you could go in there. And then C, which is completely Israeli controlled. So sometimes you would go through 3 or 4 different checkpoints, like just getting from the airport to Jerusalem. We had to go through at least 2 checkpoints where they would make sure we weren't shifty or something. I don't know. That's the hotel we stayed at, the Olive Tree Hotel, which you will be interested to know has the very olive tree under which King David composed the 23rd Psalm. Not really, because it's like that would have to be like what, 3,000 years old, and the oldest olive tree in Israel is probably like 2,200 or something like that. This is from the gift shop. I thought that was cool. They had all these olive wood carvings. When we got there, I was like, I can't wait I wonder if I can see like Jerusalem and the temple from my room. I opened the windows, and that was my view. So no, we did not get to see Jerusalem. This was the DJ down in the bar. He was I can't remember what he went by, but that dude was funny. All right, so the next morning, our first day, we went to this village of Taibe. The only time you read about it in the Bible, Jesus goes there at one point when he's trying to get away from the crowds, goes and spends a couple of days there, but it really doesn't play any part in biblical history, except that it has a house there, and a church has kind of been built there now, a Catholic church, and that's the church, that's the house. That house, it was built about the same time as America became a nation, so 240 some years ago, and not much changed in the building practices of Israel between the first century when Jesus lived there until sometime well into the 20th century. And even then, even to this day, there are a lot of people that still live in houses like this. And the way they would build is they would find it was usually on a hill, and they would find a cave system that they could kind of build some walls around and use the rest of the hill for walls too, and then it would kind of create their rooms and stuff. And so this house here, the Taibe house, is they also call it the parable house, because there are all these ways that it's like when you're looking at it, the guy would explain, this explains this parable, and this explains this parable. And so yeah, it was kind of interesting. I liked that. This is what it looks like now that the church has bought it and kind of turned it into this place where pilgrims can come and see what it was like. This is what it looked like in the 70s when it was still being lived in as a house by some Arab Christians, actually. And so you can see they've got the wheels for the grinding of grain, and even olive oil if they were olive oil farmers, and a bunch of different things. But yeah, so we're going into the house. That's the doorway. And when you walk in, if you were here for the lesson on the shepherds that I did just before Christmas, some of this will be rehashed for you. But when we walked in, so it's like you walk through that door, and right as soon as you step in, like I'm standing in the doorway, and it's like, so I'm standing there, right about here is the main floor of the house, and you can't really tell, but over here, it's like steps down to go down to the lower area where the caves are. That I thought was the back wall of the house. It's not. It's a false wall. Back there is another room. So you can see these little openings right here. those little openings up top, there's openings up there too. And so it's a chute that goes all the way up like this. They're all separated. And the people would bring in their grains, different kinds of grains, and they would fill up the chute with these different kinds of grains. And so it would be, basically this was enough to get a family of 4 or 5 through an entire year. And so when Jesus tells the story about the rich man, that his harvest is so big that he thinks to himself, I'm going to build another storehouse to hold my riches. It's like that's what this is called. This was the house's storehouse. And so what the Jews would have heard Jesus saying was, he had enough to fill up his whole house to keep him and his family fed for the year, but instead of sharing the extra that he had, he decided, I'm going to build another one of these, maybe out behind the house or something, where I will hold my riches. And that's kind of, like God says, you fool, your soul will be required of you tonight. Not because he was building another thing, but that's when Jesus says, what's more important than your soul? That's what he was talking about. That's the storehouse. And from up above, you could look down and see all the way down to the bottom. It's very cool. And if anybody has any questions, just let me know. So this is, you can't tell, but over on this side, so it's like I walk in, and on my left right here is the main house, the main floor of the house. I could go down into the basement, I guess you could kind of say it. The caves looked like a dungeon to me. But up to my right, and probably about 8 feet high, because I can reach about 8 feet, there was a ledge that went along the edge of the house where, like if they were entertaining other families, the family might sit. When somebody got married, they might sit up there, and you'd come in and you'd see them up there, and you'd be able to wave at them. And so that's where I'm standing when I took that picture. They wanted us to not take pictures. They didn't say don't take pictures, but they had a photographer, and they were like, this way you don't have to take pictures. I had my phone in my hand the whole time. I'd be walking along, I was like, what the heck? And I'm so glad I did, because they did take pictures. They did send us pictures. They sent us maybe 5 pictures of what it was like inside the Taipei house. I probably took 100. So, yeah. Huh? Up to that place where I am right there. So, let's see. Right there is a stairway, and it goes up to this area behind. And I've got pictures that'll show you. And so you would walk behind that thing, and then out over to here, and then across the ledge. And so that's how you would get up there. We had most people would love to take a trip to Israel. Mostly it is the older adults that have the means to take a trip to Israel. And so if you've ever looked at tours, you'll see they're rated like how ambulatory you must be in order to go on this particular tour, right? And so we had a few people that I was just sure were going to take a tumble while we were there. And I don't know, they somehow seemed to survive the whole trip. But yeah, there was a lady that wanted to go up there. I was like, oh, please, God, no. Please, it's like I'd be sitting there praying for the safety of the people we were with. But yeah, she got through. So yeah, so that's everybody kind of standing on the main floor. And the main floor is where they did all their living. It was the threshing floor for the household. If you were a wheat farmer, you would have a huge threshing floor where you would throw all of your wheat, and there were different ways that they would, crush it, and then they would, take these big fans and blow off the chaff, because the chaff was light and it would fly away, and the grain, the good stuff, was substantial and it would stay on the ground, and then they would sweep it all up and they would have their grain. But if you were a small family, in the law, God says to the farmers, don't don't harvest the areas around the edges, because that's for the poor. That's for the people that don't have enough. And so the farmers would get done with their harvest, and then these poor families would come in and they would glean. They would get what was left on the outside. And depending on how generous of a farmer you were, it depended on how big your edges were. And but the family then, they would be left with this wheat that they needed to process. And that's when, like I showed you you would throw it in this trough. You can't really tell from there. And then there would be these sticks sticking straight out from these wheels, and either an ox or a donkey or your children would push on and make the wheels go around and run over the top of the wheat. And then you would carry this stuff into your house, and you would throw it down on the floor, and it's the threshing floor. And you can't really see it, but there's a great big winnowing fan on the wall right there. Maybe I've got a picture that it'll show up. But it's just this great big rake that they would sort of cover with leaves and stuff, so that it became a fan. And then they would sit there and they would, like do this, and the chaff would kind of blow up and fly away, and then they would gather up their wheat and put it in their storehouses up here. So you can kind of see how it's open right there. And then they would drop it in, and it would go down in these chutes into those, and they would have a thing to keep it from all falling out. But I posted something on the Riverside Reading Through the Gospels in 90 Days thing that we're doing right now. I posted something in there today because today we read about John the Baptist in Matthew chapter 3, being confronted by the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And at the end of his rebuke of the religious leaders, the first part of his rebuke was for the Pharisees. The last part of his rebuke, I never knew it, but it was aimed directly at the Sadducees, who were the priestly, they were in charge of the temple. And he says, "One greater than me is coming, and he is going to clean his threshing floor." And I don't know how many times I've read that, dozens of times, but it never clicked. I didn't know it. But when we were standing there, our guide is David. He's over here. There he is right there. He's telling us all about this. One of the things, this blew me away. This was my first moment in Israel. He said, not many people know this, but the site of the temple in Jerusalem was on a threshing floor. I can't even pronounce the guy's name. But when David recovers the Ark of the Covenant, he needs a place to put it and to create an altar and all that stuff. And so he buys the threshing floor from this guy, from a Jebusite, who are the guys that lived there in Jerusalem. And then he made that the spot where eventually the temple was built. And so when John the Baptist says he's coming to clean his threshing floor, everybody there would have known he's coming to clean up the temple. And the Sadducees would have been like, yeah, we don't like that at all. But that's there. So that would have been their threshing floor. I don't know if that's it. Somewhere in this room is a thing, they call it a sled. And it's this heavy stone that's kind of flat. And if you didn't have one of those mills that would grind up the wheat, you would take all of the wheat in there, throw it down on your floor, and then they would wrap a rope around the thing. The kids would sit on it, and they would drag it over the wheat back and forth until it had separated the wheat from the chaff, and then they'd grab those great big forks and they would get rid of the chaff. So yeah, that's up behind. That's the storehouse right there, and you can't tell, but it's opened up on top, so you can put the grain in there. That's like a great big water trough, like that's their cistern, and so they would bring in water and dump it in there. And this is called the what is that word? Does anybody remember when I was talking about what the word for upper room is? Shoot. Yeah, anyways, that's it. That's the upper room. It's right there on the edge of my tongue. But when Luke says that the time came for the baby to be born, and they had it in the stable because there was no room in the, whatever this word is that's translated as in Luke chapter 2. It's only used, that word is only used one other time, and it's in the end of Luke when they go to find a place for the Last Supper, and Jesus tells his disciples, you'll find a upper room where we will be able to have the Last Supper. That's what this is. It's the upper room. And so almost assuredly when Luke says there wasn't room for him in the upper room, which was translated badly by the King James people as inn, guest room is another way to put it, because this part of the house would be a storage area for the most part. They kept their water here, they kept their supplies up here, but if family ever came, they would clean it all out, and this is where family would stay. And then down below, this is where the whole family slept every day. And so there's another parable where it says that some guy comes and knocks on somebody's door in the village, and the guy won't even go to the door to open it up. He opens up his window and says, I can't come to the door, my family's asleep. And I always thought it just meant I don't want to wake them up. Well, no, they're all scattered out throughout here. It's like he can't get there. And so this is where they slept. This is where family would sleep if they came. So this is where Joseph and Mary are hoping to stay, but there's no room in the, doggone it. All right. So this is kind of standing on the other side looking back towards where, like I took that last picture over here. This is that trough that I was telling you about. And they tried to put little things, little implements, little stuff that a typical first century family might have had in their house. That's the same exact picture, don't know why. Okay, so this is underneath. So I was showing you that like when you came in, up here is the main floor. If you walked down some stairs, this was underneath the house. And this is where they would bring in their animals at night, because in the first century, you didn't have banks that gave you a savings account where you had your wealth, or the stock market or anything like that. You had animals. And so if you had a cow and a goat and chickens and sheep or whatever else you might have had, you can't leave them outside because wild animals or thieves would get them. So you would bring them inside. You would take them down through the same door you came in, down those little steps, and you would put them into their, well, they called it the stable. And so underneath there would have been a manger where they would put the food for the animals, and that basically is where their animals would stay. It's another shot of it, a little cleaner. That's from an earlier picture where they had cleaned it up before the guy took his picture, but that's the same place. And so there I am. I'm standing up on that thing looking down. So yeah, so almost assuredly, when Luke says there was no room for him in the upper room, in the guest room, and that's how all of the new translations translate it, what they're saying is there wasn't any room in that guest area, so the family did put them up, but put them down with the animals, which would have been much more private and probably very warm as well, if not stinky. So yeah, there I am up top taking a picture of the people leaving. She's standing there kind of pointing at the floor. Okay, I see what's going on. So yeah, I'm standing on the main floor taking a picture as that people leave. So yeah, I think I already should. Wow, all that stuff was still there. Come on, show a picture of the other. Okay, there's right there is an oven, It was their oven, and then up above they have built-ins so that they could keep their implements and stuff. Right here is a place where probably Grandpa slept. If Grandpa's dead, then maybe Grandma. But yeah, the families all kind of lived together. And so that's the people going down into the stables. That's the oven that I was telling you about. Can you see the winnowing fork right there? And so, yeah, they would cover it with leaves. Yeah, it would depend on the family. Joseph, because he was a tradesman, probably would have had that would have been just that one house, and he would have brought. And Nazareth, it's like when we went to Nazareth, they unearthed a house just about exactly the same specifications as the Taipei house. And so, as you know, Christians throughout the years, when they find a site that they believe to be holy, would build these chapels or cathedrals on top of them. The largest church in all of the Middle East is in Nazareth. It's the Church of the Annunciation. And it sits, they built it over the top of the ruins of Nazareth. And so you walk in and you kind of walk through and you kind of go down and you walk by the place that traditionally was believed the angel visited Mary. It's this kind of cave area. You walk past that and you go outside and you go down underneath it even further, because Nazareth is built on this big hill. And so down underneath is this unearthed house that is just about exactly like this. And it could have been the place that Jesus grew up. You know, I mean, Nazareth was a town of maybe 200. And so it's like there weren't that many houses, you know, it's like, and so even if the house that we were looking at that day wasn't the house Jesus grew up in, odds are Jesus was in there, you know what I mean? Which blew me away to just be standing there going, wow, that's crazy when you think about it, how small it was. Same thing with Bethlehem, town of maybe 300, you know? And so, yeah, but Jesus didn't grow up there, so just born there. So, yeah, they would, if they were larger families and if they were more wealthy, build a room onto the house that was already there. But not if you were well enough to do. We would go, I don't think we have the sound on, but right now what's going on is we're standing there in the house. Michael Card gave a little devotional, and then he got out his guitar, and because we were there to talk about the birth of Jesus. And so he gets out his guitar and he starts playing the song Emmanuel. And it was just absolutely beautiful. And that was kind of the way that the tour went. We would go, you know, and we would stop at a place. Sometimes it would be a little house like this. Sometimes it'd be outside, sitting on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Sometimes you'd be in like a medieval chapel that has, you know, like the soaring buttresses, and the sound just sounds, I mean, yeah. So yeah, that's what that was. And then there are cats everywhere in Israel, and I don't know why. I never saw a dog, never once, but there were cats everywhere. And Jonathan, that was his favorite part. So there are pictures of cats everywhere we go. And most of the time, Jonathan's down there petting them. And as a matter of fact, and every once in a while, like regularly, we'd be there doing something, we'd be outside, and the guy, our tour director, would be talking, and all of a sudden you hear this, and and they'd be fighting and stuff. We were in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, which Jerusalem now sits 200 feet above 200, 20 or to 30 feet above the level where it was when Jesus walked and lived in the first century. And so any excavating has to be done underneath an already functioning city, right? And so they've done that. They haven't for the most part been able to do that in the Muslim quarter, the Armenian quarter a little bit, but in the Jewish quarter, they dig down, they prop it up, they do all this stuff. So we were down there and we're looking at the Sadducees' mansions. Like the Jerusalem priests were fabulously wealthy. And so we're walking through these mansions that, are just massive. And the guy is sitting there talking, and all of a sudden I look down, there's a cat in the Sadducees' bedroom, right? It's just, they get everywhere. And the guy's talking along, and I just keep looking, and all of a sudden I see another cat come through a window, and then all of a sudden it's like, I could see him getting ready to pounce, and sure enough, man, these cats are just fighting 20 feet underneath Jerusalem in the middle of this guy's speech, and it's like, oh, it bothered him when he would be interrupted. And you're interrupted all the time by cats, they have these giant parakeets that are about as big as a parrot, right? And they're bright green, and they squawk so loud. And you'd be outside. They were only in Galilee, but you'd be outside in Galilee. All of a sudden, it's a crack, crack. It's like, and he would just get so angry, so frustrated. But yeah, cats everywhere. That's the Catholic Church. And then this is us just kind of heading back to Jerusalem. This is the way that this is sort of central Israel, I guess you would call it, kind of about the same, at the same level or longitude as Tel Aviv. But there were olive trees everywhere, and I don't know if you can tell, there were rocks everywhere. And so when Jesus is said to be a carpenter or the son of a carpenter, the word just means tradesman. And so almost assuredly he was a stonemason, because there were, as you can see, there are very few trees, but there are stones everywhere. And so you didn't even have to quarry them if you weren't too terribly picky. You just pick them up off the ground and shape them and stack them. So yeah, it's all rocks just laying on the top of the thing. All right, so we stopped on the way. It's like there was just this spot where they would pull over, and they were like, "Hurry, get off the bus, because the guy would have to move because he was blocking the road. But what we were going to stop at was called the Sheep Pen, and it was an example of, it's still used by shepherds to this day. And you'd be driving through Israel, and you'd just see a guy over there with about 30 or 40 sheep and a dog, and there wasn't anybody here at this one, but you could. There was evidence that they had been there not too long beforehand, and so that's us walking over to the sheep pen. I've got a better picture of it, I'm sure. Okay, there it is. So they've stacked rocks around, and then this great big rock area you're going to see in a second is like a natural cave. And so the shepherds would hang out underneath there. There's a place where you could see where they always had fires. And then there's this little tiny opening where the sheep would come and go through. And what the shepherd would do is once he got his sheep in there, he would lay down and sleep right there. And so when Jesus says, "I'm the gate," he's talking about that he leads his sheep in and that he lays down right there. And, the sheep can't. It's really more, because it's really more for protecting the stupid sheep from wandering out and getting into trouble than it is from predators getting in there. Because as you can see, it's maybe 3, maybe 4 feet high. A wolf or, a lion or something could get in there, no problem. But when the shepherd would lay down there. It was to keep the sheep from getting out. And so, yeah, that's standing in the sheep pen, looking out. It was January, so this would all eventually be crops, but it's January, and so it's all just kind of waiting for spring. But Israel, when Israel inhabited the land before the Assyrians and the Babylonians came and took them away, Israel was mostly an agrarian society. They were farmers, and that was their number one thing was olives and wheat and stuff like that. The Arab people were not so much into farming. Arabs, nothing against them, that's just the way they saw life, right? They wanted mostly to be moving around and never settled down. As a matter of fact, they really kind of despised farmers. They thought, why would you tie yourself down to one particular piece of land? And so in the centuries between 500 BC up until 1950, the nation of Israel has very, very little farming going on. But when the Jews come back, that's the first thing they start doing. They start farming again. And so everywhere you went, you'd see things that you're like, how are they farming there? But they were. And their number one export right now is bananas, which is bananas as far as I'm concerned. That's strange. But you would be at, especially up north by the Sea of Galilee, they would have these banana trees growing and these great big white plastic things over the top of them. And so you'd be standing up on the Mount of Beatitudes and looking down at the Sea of Galilee. There's just all these places with this white visqueen over the top. It was bananas. There's that cave underneath underneath that thing, and that's where the shepherds. And so see, they stacked up the rocks so that the sheep couldn't get through there, but the smoke could still get out. That's my panorama shot. There's the area where the gate, where he'd lay down and sleep. That's the sheep gate. And everywhere you would go, this is on the ground. It looks like I'm taking a picture of a cave, right? But it was on the ground. And the hole was maybe that big. But as I was walking away, because I was always the last one to leave an area, because all of those people were older, right? And so I could catch up with them, no problem. And so I'd stay behind taking pictures after everybody was gone, But there was this one lady that was working for the tour group. Her name was Susan, and she was the shepherdess. She would make sure that there were no stray sheep, that when we got to the bus, everybody was there. And so she would always be back there waiting for me to get done, And as I'm walking, she goes, "Watch out for the pit." And I'm like, "The what?" She goes, "The pit." And I would have stepped right in that thing. They've kind of tried to pile in rocks. But it always killed me because in the law, if you read in Leviticus and Numbers and stuff, there's laws about if your oxen falls in a pit on the Sabbath, here are the rules for getting them out, right? And there are all these things. Jesus says at one point, if your son falls into a pit on the Sabbath, you're not going to leave him in there. You're going to get him out. With Joseph, when Joseph is taken by his brothers, they throw him in a pit until the time comes when the Ishmaelites are coming through and they pull him out and they sell him to the Ishmaelites and off they go. I always thought, what are there pits everywhere there? Yes, there are. And it's why they build their houses the way they do, because it just kind of all these caves and all these natural, and yeah, so crazy. So let's see, that was Taipei. We left Taipei. The sheep pen is probably right in this area somewhere. And then we went all the way back through Jerusalem, past a couple more checkpoints, and ended up at the Herodian. Let's see, 721. Yeah, we'll go through that. So this is just pictures of what it looks like in in the interior of Israel. There are all these little settlements, I guess you could call them. Some of them are Palestinian. Some of them are Jewish. They are very politically explosive situations. And so when we would ask, we'd be like, "Hey, what's that over there?" Our guide, I don't know why he didn't just say, "We're not allowed to talk about that," right? But he would act like, "Oh, there's nothing over there," or he'd be like, "Oh, and pretty soon we pieced it together that he's not, he works for the tour company, but he's licensed by the state of Israel, right? And so there were just some things that he's told, you're not allowed to talk about this. And that's one of them. And so pretty soon we stopped asking about these large, some of them looked like fortresses. And this is one. This is a Palestinian one. You could always tell the difference because in the Palestinian ones, there would be a minaret signaling that there's a mosque there. And in the Jewish ones, there wasn't. That's just some little random village as we drove through Israel. I just found it fascinating. There's one of the checkpoints. The guy would be like, "Don't take pictures. Don't take pictures." And we asked later, when we were in Nazareth, we asked some guy, we were like, do the Israelis, does the government get mad if you take pictures at checkpoints? He goes, "No, the soldiers will wave to you and pose, with their guns and stuff." He's like, they want this stuff out there on the internet knowing that it's a safe place to come. And so, yeah, it's like when you would leave one of those zones, like A or B, or B or C, because we never went in A. When you would leave one of those zones, there would be these checkpoints. And every once in a while, most of the time, they just kind of, wave you through. But every once in a while, a guy would get on the bus and walk through and just kind of look at everybody and make sure everybody looks like they're supposed to be there, type of thing. There's that sign. The entrance for Israeli citizens is forbidden, dangerous to your lives, and it is against the Israeli law. So, like, that means that you're headed into one of those A zones that's Arab-controlled, Palestinian-controlled, and, like, the Israeli military doesn't go in there, the police force doesn't go in there, the, Israeli emergency services don't go in there. That is completely controlled by the Palestinian Authority. And so I guess technically if I was in my own car, I would be allowed to drive in there, but all of the guidebooks say, unless you've got an Arab guide, don't do that. And so, yeah, but you would see these every once in a while. And up north, it would be even worse because there would be landmines on both sides, and it was really kind of crazy. That's the walls of Jerusalem. They are, as we drove by, the guy said, those are some relatively new walls. They're only 800 years old. And so what you see here, where people are walking right now, and you can see these are Jewish people. They, they're Hasidic Jews. I found them really interesting, and families walking back and forth. But this area right here that you see, the ground level of Jerusalem is 20 feet higher than where Jesus walked. And so, when you would get in there, and we saw, we went over and we're looking at the temple, they would dig down and open up areas where it's like you look down and it's like they have a strip of the path that Jesus would have walked to get into the temple, and we got to walk on it. That was pretty cool. But when you're walking the streets of Jerusalem now, it's like, because the Romans tore down Jerusalem in 70 AD, and then a few years later, I don't know if it was Domitian or Hadrian, one of the Jewish emperors, he built a city on top. I can't remember what he called it. He renamed it because he was so mad at the Jews. and they built a temple of Diana where the Temple Mount is, where the temple of Yahweh had been. And that kind of stayed that way until the Arabs came through in like, I don't know, 600 AD, whenever it was that they come through with Muhammad and all that, and they destroyed Jerusalem, and then they rebuilt it, and so every time they rebuild it, it keeps getting a little taller and a little taller. And that Dome of the Rock that you see when you see all those pictures of Jerusalem, that sits on the Temple Mount now, and almost assuredly right where the Holy of Holies was in the days of Jesus. So that's David's Tower. It's just a minaret, actually. Nobody knows why they call it David's Tower, because David has very little to do with Islam, but it's called, that's it, David's Tower. I just was like blown away when this is the first we've seen the walls of Jerusalem, and I'm like, oh, that is so cool. Oh yeah, all the time. I've got some video of us like in Jerusalem, and you could hear them and you could see the Muslims going to pray, And it was interesting because it's like the Muslims would be going this way, and the Jewish people, especially the ones that are dressed specifically Jewish, would be walking the other way, and it was like they just kind of, wander around each other. As a matter of fact, when we were in the Galilee somewhere, I can't remember where, but we were talking to a guy. It was our bus driver. Duh. Our bus driver was an Arab Christian, and so he was born and raised in Cana, and it's like there are pockets of Christianity there that have been there for the last 2,000 years, and so there have always been Arab Christians. And when Muhammad comes through, whatever year it is that Muhammad comes through, he would allow Christians and Jews to remain Christians and Jews because he called them people of the book. Because the Muslims also honor the Old and New Testament. They just believe that the Quran is what finally kind of wraps it all up and brings it to its head, to its final conclusion. And so they would leave Jews and Christians alone. Now, if you didn't convert and you stayed Jew or Christian, you had to pay a tax that Muslims didn't have to pay. But you could stay, you could live in the Muslim empire and remain Jew or Christian. But if you were a pagan, they would say convert or die. And so like if you worshipped Baal still, or if you worshipped Zeus or Ashtarte or whatever other pagan god, he had absolutely no patience for pagans. But so we would hear the call to prayer all the time, and it was beautiful. It's like, but it was strange. And on the Sabbath, before the Sabbath, so on Friday afternoon, we were in Jerusalem, and there's an app that you could get as a Jew that would tell you time to head home now, so that you would get home before sunset. And so it was fascinating. It's like you'd be in Jerusalem and everything would be going along like normal, and all of a sudden there would come this time, and there was just this sea of these Jewish, Hasidic Jews especially, just making their way out of Jerusalem to go home. And we were like, what's going on? Because they all looked like they were they were just on a mission, And the guy was like, oh yeah, their app just went off. And I was like, that's hysterical. I wonder what the Mishnah and the Talmud says about apps on your iPhone for warning you about the coming of the Sabbath. I just thought that was interesting. It was a beautiful day. It was cold, but it was beautiful. We stopped to look at the Herodian. I'm just going to explain the Herodian, and we won't actually get inside of it, but I will explain it because this was my second moment in Israel. Um, these two mountains here used to be the same size. They were basically, I can't remember what they called them, like twins or something like that. Looked like the exact same mountain. But Herod was paranoid for very good reason, and he was constantly trying to figure out how to keep himself safe no matter where he was in the promised land, in Israel. And so he had, I think it was 13 of these mountain fortresses sprinkled throughout Israel. And so Masada is the most famous one, but the Herodian is another. It's just outside of Bethlehem. Jericho is another. He had a mountain fortress at Jericho. Basically, he wanted to have it so that no matter where he was in the country, if suddenly his life was in danger, he had one of these fortresses to run to. And so he decided the reason he built one here is it wasn't the perfect spot for it. But when he was trying to conquer Israel for the Romans, he was told by Mark Antony. Mark Antony was his what do they call it? He was Mark Antony's client. Mark Antony was his patron. And so Mark Antony is the one that basically, pulled some strings and made it. They basically said to Herod, who was not Jewish, but was married to a Jewish princess, and Herod was descended from Esau. So it's like Jacob and Esau. So Herod is a descendant of Abraham. It's just through Esau's line. He marries a Jewish princess. Mark Antony says, if you can conquer it, you can have it. And so he brings mercenaries, and he comes in, and he's fighting all these battles and trying to take over Israel. And at one point, he loses a battle badly. He had brought his mother with him to see the battle. And so when things go wrong, he gets in the chariot with his mom, and he's trying to scoot out of there as quickly as he can. And when he got right by here, there's this terrible accident, and the chariot rolls over, and he's just sure that his mom is dead. And he said, and when he finally gets to her, she's not dead. She's not even really hurt. And so he believes it is a sign from the God of Israel. And he says, one day, if you let me take this land, I will build a monument to you here at this place. And so he eventually takes the land, and what he does is he builds a place and calls it the Herodian, which is a monument to him. But when he gets there, they're the same height. And so if he builds his fortress on this level, an army would be able to come up onto this thing and lob stuff into, it's like that's not a good strategic place to do it. So he has the top of this mountain removed, and they carry it right over there and bring it up and deposit it on here. And they build it up so that it is the highest point in all of Judea, basically. But it's a man-made mountain. And it's not only a man-made mountain, it is a mountain that has been moved. And so, supposedly, when Jesus says, if you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to a mountain, move from here to there, and it would move. Nothing would be impossible for you. Our guide was saying every single person that heard him would have immediately thought of the mountain that Herod moved to create the Herodian. And that they would have been saying, with faith, that may seem terribly impressive that he moved that mountain, but with faith, that's nothing. That's it's like, and here we are 2,000 years later, and it's just ruins now. But Jesus is, the foundation that Jesus built is still going strong. So we'll talk next week about what's up there and pictures of the fortress that is in there. But does anybody have any questions? What did he say? All right, well, you'll be happy to know we're done. So let's pray. Father, we thank you for this day and for this opportunity to come and talk about your Son and talk about these different principles that we find in the Bible. Bless us as we leave this place and help us every day to strive to become more about the one that this book is written about. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right.